The handcuffs clicked shut around Margaret Chen's wrists, as her neighbors watched from their pristine porches her crime. A dandelion-covered lawn that would destroy everything she'd worked for, and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Willowbrook's most exclusive community. Margaret Chen had always believed that owning a home in Willowbrook Estates meant security. The 45-year-old nurse had scraped together every penny for the down payment on her modest two-bedroom house, dreaming of a quiet retirement in the tree-lined suburb. What she didn't anticipate was that her American dream would become a legal nightmare orchestrated by the very people sworn to protect property values. It started innocently enough. Margaret worked double shifts at the county hospital, often pulling 16-hour days to pay her mortgage and care for her elderly mother. Her lawn, admittedly, wasn't magazine perfect. Dandelions dotted the grass, and her flower beds looked more wild than manicured. But in Margaret's mind, a lived-in yard was better than the sterile perfection that surrounded her. The first warning letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, signed by Helena Blackwood, the whole president. The letter was professional, but cold, citing section 4.2 of the Community Covenant regarding landscape maintenance standards. Margaret had 30 days to comply or face escalating penalties. "I work nights saving lives," Margaret told her neighbor, Jim Rodriguez, as they chatted over the fence. "I'm sorry if my dandelions offend anyone, but I barely have time to sleep, let alone obsess over grass height." Jim nodded sympathetically. He'd received his own warnings about his vegetable garden, which apparently violated the aesthetic harmony requirements. "Helena's been getting more aggressive lately," he confided. "She's targeting anyone who doesn't fit her vision of perfection." Margaret tried to comply. She spent her one day off weeding and planting HOA-approved shrubs, but working nights and caring for her mother left little time for lawn perfection. When the second notice arrived in May, the fines had escalated to $100 per day. The third letter changed everything. Helena's tone had shifted from professional to personal. "Your continued defiance shows a blatant disregard for community standards and property values. Your neighbor's investments are being threatened by your negligence." Margaret felt the words like a physical blow. She'd served this community for 15 years as a nurse, had saved lives of people living just streets away, and now she was being painted as a threat to their investments. The harassment escalated. Beyond letters, Margaret noticed Helena's car parked outside her house at odd hours, photographing her property. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city about everything from her mailbox pane to her porch light being a bright. Each citation meant more fines, more legal fees, more stress. "This isn't about my lawn anymore," Margaret confided to her attorney, David Park, during their first meeting. "This feels personal." David reviewed the mounting stack of violations and fines. "Mrs. Chen, you're looking at over $15,000 in penalties. They're claiming your property is a public nuisance that's affecting neighborhood property values." The breaking point came on a sweltering August morning. Margaret had just finished a grueling night shift when she found Helena Blackwood standing in her front yard with a city inspector and a police officer. Helena's perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't show a trace of the morning humidity, and her white pantsuit remained pristine despite the heat. "Officer Martinez, as you can see, the violation continues," Helena announced, her voice carrying across the street to where other neighbors had gathered to watch. "The weeds, the unkempt appearance, it's affecting all of our property values." Margaret stepped onto her porch, still wearing her hospital scrubs. "What's going on here?" Helena turned with a satisfied smile. "Mrs. Chen, you've ignored multiple legal notices. The HOA board has voted to pursue criminal charges for willful violation of community covenants. Criminal charges for dandelions. Margaret's voice cracked with exhaustion and disbelief. Officer Martinez looked uncomfortable, but stepped forward. "Ma'am, there's a warrant for your arrest for repeated violations of municipal ordinances. You'll need to come with me," as the handcuffs clicked into place. Margaret saw the triumphant expression on Helena's face. Neighbors who had once waved hello now stared from their doorways with mixtures of shock and judgment. Mrs. Patterson from next door shook her head disapprovingly, while Jim Rodriguez stood on his porch with his fists clenched, clearly wanting to intervene, but held back by his own legal troubles with the HOA. "This isn't over," Margaret called out as she was led to the patrol car. "There's something wrong here, something bigger than lawn violations." Helena's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something fear crossing her features before the mask of righteous authority returned as the police car pulled away. Margaret caught sight of Helena pulling out her phone and making a quick call. Through the rear window, she watched her house growing smaller, not knowing that within weeks, she'd receive the foreclosure notice that would threaten to take away everything she'd worked for. The arrest made the local news, local nurse jailed over lawn violations. But what the headlines didn't capture was the systematic campaign that had led to this moment, or the web of corruption and personal vendetta that Margaret was about to uncover. In her jail cell that night, Margaret made a promise to herself. She would fight back, and she would expose whatever dark secret Helena Blackwood was so desperate to protect. What she didn't know was that her quest for justice would reveal a conspiracy that reached far beyond HOA politics, involving fraud, embezzlement, and a network of corruption that had been bleeding the community dry for years. The war for Willowbrook Estates was just beginning. Margaret Chen's release from county jail after 3 days felt like emerging from a nightmare, only to discover the real horror was just beginning. Her arrest photo had been shared across neighborhood social media groups, and the whispers followed her everywhere. But Margaret had spent those 3 days in a cell planning her counterattack, and what she uncovered would shake Willowbrook Estates to its foundation. "They want to destroy me. Fine," Margaret muttered to herself as she sat in attorney David Park's office, surrounded by boxes of HOA documents they subpoenaed. "But I'm taking them down with me." David looked up from a financial report, his expression grim. "Margaret, what I'm seeing here doesn't make sense. The HOA's books show massive discrepancies. Money that should be going to community maintenance is disappearing." Margaret leaned forward, her nurse's analytical mind kicking into gear. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Well, for starters, the HOA claims to have spent $100, zero on landscape maintenance last year, but I can only find invoices for maybe $50, zero worth of actual work. The rest, payments to shell companies that don't seem to exist." The revelation sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "You think Helena's been embezzling? I think this goes deeper than embezzlement. I think your lawn violations were a smokescreen to distract from something much bigger." Their investigation gained momentum when Jim Rodriguez knocked on Margaret's door late one evening. Looking over his shoulder nervously, "I've been keeping track," he whispered, handing her a thick folder. "Every violation, every fine, every family that's been forced out. There's a pattern." Margaret opened the folder to find meticulous records spanning 3 years. Photos, letters, timelines, it was all there. "Jim, this is incredible. How long have you been documenting this?" "Since they came after the Washingtons 2 years ago. Same playbook, nitpicky violations, escalating fines, then foreclosure. Except the Washingtons' house was worth $400,000, and guess who bought it at auction for $150,000. Margaret's blood ran cold. Helena, her company, Blackwood Properties. She flips the houses and sells them for full market value. She's made millions, while destroying families. The next morning brought devastating news. Margaret found the foreclosure notice taped to her front door. Notice of default, and election to sell. She had 30 days before her house would go to auction. They're accelerating the timeline. David explained during an emergency meeting. The accumulated fines, legal fees, and penalties now exceed $45,000. They're claiming you defaulted on your mortgage covenant by violating HOA rules. Margaret felt the walls closing in. David, I don't have $45,000. Even if I did, paying it would be admitting guilt. This is extortion. Then we fight. But we need evidence, smoking gun evidence that proves Helena's running a criminal enterprise. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Teresa Mills, Helena's former assistant, appeared at Margaret's doorstep with a flash drive in trembling hands. I can't stay long, she whispered, glancing around nervously. But you need to see this. The flash drive contained 3 years of Helena's private emails, voice recordings of board meetings, and financial documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Helena hadn't just been targeting non-conforming homeowners, she'd been manipulating HOA rules to specifically target properties she wanted to acquire. Listen to this, Teresa said, playing a recording on her phone. Helena's voice came through clearly. The Chen property will be perfect for renovation. Keep documenting violations until we have enough to foreclose. Make sure the citations come from multiple departments, city, county, HOA. Overwhelm her legal resources. Margaret's hands shook as she heard her life being discussed like a business transaction. Why are you helping me? Teresa's eyes filled with tears. Because you're not the first. Helena's been doing this for years, and I've been her accomplice. The guilt was eating me alive, especially after what happened to the Johnson family. The Johnsons, elderly couple who lost their house over a fence height violation. Mr. Johnson had a heart attack during the foreclosure proceedings. Helena bought their house for $125,000 and sold it 6 months later for $380,000. Teresa's voice broke. They're in a nursing home now because they can't afford anywhere else. Margaret felt a surge of rage and determination. Teresa, will you testify? I'll do more than that. I have Helena's personal computer password. She keeps backup files of everything on her home system. That night, Margaret found herself in Helena's backyard with Teresa, watching through the kitchen window as Helena left for her weekly bridge club. She'll be gone for 3 hours, Teresa whispered as she used her key to enter the house. Helena's home office was a shrine to her real estate success awards, photos of sold properties, and a large map of Willowbrook estates with different colored pins marking each house. Margaret realized with horror that the red pins marked houses that had been foreclosed and flipped, while yellow pins marked current targets. Her own house had a yellow pin. Teresa accessed Helena's computer while Margaret photographed everything. The files revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Helena had been colluding with city inspectors, paying them to issue frivolous violations. She manipulated HOA board elections by intimidating opponents. Most shocking of all, she'd been inflating community assessment fees and pocketing the difference. My God, Margaret breathed, reading through email chains. She's stolen over $2 million from the community fund. Money that was supposed to go to playground maintenance, street repairs. It gets worse, Teresa said, pulling up another file. She's been reporting false crime statistics to insurance companies to inflate premiums, then splitting the excess with her insurance agent brother-in-law. A car door slammed outside. Helena was home early. Quick, we need to go, Teresa hissed, copying the last files to her flash drive. They slipped out the back door just as Helena's front door opened. Margaret's heart pounded as they crept through the neighbor's yard. Precious evidence clutched in her hands. The next morning, Margaret called an emergency press conference on her front lawn, surrounded by neighbors who had suffered under Helena's regime. Local news crews gathered as Margaret stood next to her dandelion-covered yard, no longer ashamed but defiant. 3 days ago, I was arrested for having weeds in my yard, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the cameras. Today, I'm here to expose a criminal conspiracy that has been systematically stealing from our community and destroying families for profit. She held up printouts of Helena's emails and financial records. Helena Blackwood hasn't been protecting property values. She's been manipulating them for personal gain. She's embezzled over $1 million, bribed city officials, and used fraudulent HOA violations to steal people's homes. The crowd murmured with growing anger as Margaret detailed the evidence. Jim Rodriguez stepped forward with his documentation, and Teresa Mills, despite her fear, stood beside Margaret to corroborate the claims. This ends now, Margaret declared. Helena Blackwood, if you're watching this, you can try to foreclose on my house, but you can't foreclose on the truth. As the news crews packed up, Margaret noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Helena's car. Through the windshield, she could see Helena on her phone, gesticulating wildly. Margaret smiled grimly. The game had changed, and Helena was no longer holding all the cards. That evening, Margaret received a call from David Park. Margaret, Helena's attorney just contacted me. She wants to settle, drop all charges, forgive all fines, and pay damages. How much? $50,000. And a guarantee that she'll resign from the whole board. Margaret looked out her window at her dandelion-covered lawn, thinking of the Johnson family in their nursing home, of all the other families who had lost their homes to Helena's greed. Tell her no, Margaret said firmly. We're going to court. This isn't about money anymore, it's about justice. The courtroom showdown was set for the following week, but Margaret had no idea that Helena had one final, desperate card to play, one that would threaten not just Margaret's house, but her freedom itself. The courthouse steps buzzed with reporters and protesters as Margaret Chen walked through the crowd, her head held high despite the weight of what lay ahead. Signs reading "Justice for Homeowners" and "Stop HOA Tyranny" dotted the gathering. But Margaret knew that Helena Blackwood wouldn't go down without a vicious fight. Inside courtroom 7, Judge Patricia Hawthorne called the proceedings to order. Helena sat at the defendant's table in an immaculate navy suit, her lawyer Richard Sterling whispering urgently in her ear. Margaret noticed Helena's confidence, the same smug expression she'd worn during the arrest. Something was wrong. Your Honor, Sterling began, rising with theatrical flair. Before we proceed with Miss Chen's allegations, we must address a serious matter. My client has discovered evidence that Miss Chen has been engaged in criminal activity herself. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. David Park shot to his feet. Objection. This is a transparent attempt to deflect from Mr. Park. Judge Hawthorne interrupted. I'll allow Mr. Sterling to present his evidence, but it better be substantial. Sterling smiled coldly and activated a laptop. Your Honor, we have surveillance footage showing Miss Chen breaking and entering into my client's home, stealing private documents. The courtroom gasped as grainy security footage played on the overhead screen. Margaret watched herself following Teresa Mills into Helena's house, her stomach dropping as she realized they'd been caught. Furthermore, Sterling continued, we have evidence that Miss Chen has been orchestrating a harassment campaign against Ms. Blackwood, including death threats and vandalism. He presented a series of printouts, angry emails, threatening voicemails, photos of Helena's car with keyed paint. Margaret stared in shock. She never sent those messages or damaged anyone's property. This is fabricated, Margaret whispered to David, but her voice carried in the silent courtroom. Judge Hawthorne frowned. Miss Chen, these are serious allegations. How do you respond? David stood slowly, his mind racing. Your Honor, we need time to examine this so-called evidence. These accusations are clearly documented. Sterling interrupted, presenting another folder. We also have testimony from multiple witnesses who saw Miss Chen exhibiting erratic and threatening behavior. The courtroom door opened, and Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the witnesses filing in. Mrs. Patterson, her next-door neighbor, Bill Morrison from the whole board, and 3 other neighbors she thought were friends. Mrs. Patterson took the stand first, her voice shaking. I saw Margaret screaming at Helena's house at midnight, throwing rocks at her windows. She was drunk and shouting about revenge. Margaret wanted to scream. She'd been working a night shift at the hospital during the time Mrs. Patterson claimed to have seen her, but she watched in horror as, one by one, her neighbors testified to behavior she'd never exhibited, conversations that had never happened, threats she'd never made. Your Honor, David said desperately, my client has alibis for these alleged incidents. She was working at County General Hospital. About that. Sterling interrupted smoothly. He handed a document to the judge. Miss Chen was actually suspended from her nursing position 2 weeks ago for stealing medication. She's been lying about her work schedule. The courtroom erupted. Margaret stared at the document in disbelief. It was her employee file, but completely fabricated. She'd never been suspended, never stolen medication. Her nursing license was spotless. This is insane, Margaret shouted, jumping to her feet. None of this is true. Helena's bribing these people, fabricating evidence. Miss Chen, Judge Hawthorne, banged her gavel. Control yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt. Helena leaned back in her chair, that familiar smug smile playing at her lips. She'd orchestrated this perfectly, overwhelming Margaret with false accusations, discrediting her with manufactured evidence, turning her own neighbors against her. But Teresa Mills had been watching from the gallery, and she'd had enough. Your Honor, Teresa stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. I have something to say. Sterling spun around, his face pale. Your Honor, this woman has no standing in these proceedings. I was Helena Blackwood's assistant for 3 years, Teresa declared, walking toward the front of the courtroom. And everything being presented here is a lie. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. Ma'am, if you have relevant testimony, you need to be sworn in properly. As Teresa took the witness stand, Margaret noticed Helena frantically texting on her phone. Whatever Teresa was about to reveal, Helena was trying to stop it. Ms. Mills, David said, taking control of the questioning, you were employed by the defendant. Yes, and I helped her fabricate this entire case against Margaret Chen. Teresa's voice grew stronger with each word. The surveillance footage is real, but Margaret was there with me. I invited her in because I had evidence of Helena's crimes. Sterling objected repeatedly, but Teresa pressed on. The threatening emails and voicemails? Helena wrote them herself and sent them from fake accounts. The witness testimonies? She's been blackmailing those neighbors with their own HOA violations. That's preposterous. Helena finally exploded, jumping to her feet. Your Honor, this woman is mentally unstable. She was fired for "I wasn't fired," Teresa said calmly. "I quit 2 days ago because I couldn't be part of this anymore. And I have recordings to prove everything I'm saying." Teresa pulled out her phone and played a crystal clear recording of Helena's voice. "Make sure the Chen woman looks unstable. Bribe Patterson if you have to. Threaten Morrison with foreclosure, whatever it takes to discredit her testimony. And give me those fake hospital records from your contact in HR." The courtroom fell dead silent. Helena's face went white as she realized her own voice had just confessed to multiple felonies in open court. Furthermore, Teresa continued, Helena has been running a criminal enterprise for years. She's embezzled community funds, bribed city officials, and systematically targeted homeowners for foreclosure fraud. David presented the flash drive of evidence to the judge. "Your Honor, this contains 3 years of financial records, emails, and recorded conversations proving a pattern of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy." Judge Hawthorne examined the evidence while Helena sat frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Sterling whispered urgently to his client, but Helena seemed to be in shock. "Your Honor," David continued, "we also have testimony from other victims of Ms. Blackwood's scheme." The courtroom doors opened again, but this time it was Jim Rodriguez leading a group of former Willowbrook residents, the Washingtons, the Johnsons, Mr. Johnson in a wheelchair, but determined to testify, and 6 other families who had lost their homes to Helena's fraudulent foreclosures. One by one, they testified about the same pattern: manufactured violations, escalating fines, impossible demands, and ultimately losing their homes to Helena's shell companies. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Helena's lawyer attempted damage control, but the avalanche of testimony and documented evidence was insurmountable. The fake case against Margaret was falling apart, replaced by a mountain of evidence against Helena herself. "Your Honor," Sterling said weakly, "my client invokes her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, but it was too late." Judge Hawthorne had heard enough. "Ms. Blackwood," the judge said sternly, "based on the evidence presented today, I'm dismissing all charges and claims against Ms. Chen. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate criminal investigation into your activities." Helena finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand. There are others involved. If I go down, I'm taking everyone with me." Margaret felt a chill at Helena's words. Others involved. How deep did this conspiracy go? As court officers moved to place Helena under arrest, she turned to Margaret with a desperate look. "You have no idea what you've uncovered. They'll never let you keep that house. They'll never let any of this end." Margaret stared into Helena's eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not fear of going to prison, but fear of something or someone else. The victory felt hollow as Margaret watched Helena being led away in handcuffs. The immediate threat was over, but Helena's final words echoed in her mind. Who were they? And what did Helena mean about never letting this end? As the courtroom emptied, Margaret noticed a man in an expensive suit who had been sitting in the back row throughout the proceedings. He hadn't testified, hadn't spoken to anyone, but he'd been taking notes on everything. As their eyes met, he smiled coldly and walked out without a word. Margaret's fight was far from over. In fact, she was about to discover that Helena Blackwood had been just a small fish in a much larger pond than the real puppet masters were only now beginning to show themselves. 6 months after Helena Blackwood's arrest, Margaret Chen stood in her front yard, watching contractors install a new fence, one that violated every HOA rule ever written. The dandelions had been joined by wildflowers, and she'd never been happier. that have the most non-conforming lawn in Willowbrook Estates. The criminal trial had been swift and decisive. Helena was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. The HOA was dissolved, its assets frozen and distributed as restitution to victims. Margaret received $150,000 in damages, enough to pay off her mortgage and start fresh, but the victory felt incomplete. Helena's cryptic warning about others had proven prophetic in ways Margaret never could have imagined. "Margaret," Jim Rodriguez called from across the street, jogging over with a newspaper in his hand. "You need to see this," the headline made. Margaret's blood run cold. Federal investigation reveals nationwide HOA fraud network. The article detailed a massive conspiracy involving dozens of communities across 3 states, all following the same playbook Helena had used in Willowbrook. "It's bigger than we thought," Jim said, his voice grim. Helena was part of a whole network. They've been systematically targeting middle-class homeowners, especially minorities and elderly residents, stealing their homes and flipping them for profit. Margaret read the article with growing horror. The scheme involved corrupt city officials, bribed inspectors, fake assessment companies, and a web of shell corporations, all funneling money to a single source, Meridian Property Group, owned by none other than the mysterious man in the expensive suit who had watched her trial, Robert Ashford. Margaret read aloud. 47 years old, former real estate mogul turned community development consultant. Her phone rang. It was David Park, her attorney, and his voice was urgent. "Margaret, we need to meet now. There's been a development." An hour later, Margaret sat in David's office, staring at a thick folder marked "Confidential." "The FBI contacted me this morning," David explained. "Helena's been talking. She's agreed to testify against the entire network in exchange for a reduced sentence." "That's good news, right?" David's expression was grim. "Margaret, there's something else. Helena claims that your case wasn't random. You were specifically targeted." Margaret felt a chill. "What do you mean?" According to Helena, Meridian Property Group had been watching you for 2 years. They knew about your mother's medical bills, your work schedule, your financial situation. You were the perfect victim, isolated, overworked, with just enough equity in your house to make it worth stealing. But why me specifically? David pulled out another document. "Because of this." Margaret stared at a land survey map of Willowbrook Estates. Her property was highlighted in red, along with several others forming a clear pattern. "Your house sits on top of what's going to be the main access road for a new shopping complex," David explained. "Meridian has been secretly buying up properties in this area for years, but they needed your land to complete the project. When you refused to sell, I was never asked to sell." "Exactly. That's when they decided to take it by force, using Helena and the HOA's cover." Margaret studied the map, seeing the bigger picture for the first time. "So everything, the lawn violations, the rest, the foreclosure, it was all just to steal my land for a shopping mall. A shopping mall worth over $200 million. Your little house was the final piece of the puzzle." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought about all the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the fear of losing everything. It had all been orchestrated by people she'd never met, for a project she'd never heard of. "David, we have to stop them. If Helena testifies, she already has. The FBI raided Meridian's offices yesterday. They found everything: the target lists, the bribe records, the shell company structures. Robert Ashford was arrested this morning." Margaret should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt overwhelmed. how many other families went through what I did. Based on the evidence, over 800 families across the network. Many of them lost their homes and never knew why. That evening, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Teresa Mills stood on her doorstep, looking older and more tired than when she testified 6 months earlier. "I wanted to apologize. In person," Teresa said quietly, "and to tell you something Helena made me promise never to reveal." Margaret invited her in, serving coffee in her bright kitchen, the same kitchen she'd almost lost to corporate greed. "Helena didn't choose you randomly," Teresa began. "There was another reason Meridian wanted your specific property." Margaret waited, sensing another revelation coming. "Your house isn't just sitting on the access road site. It's sitting on top of a contaminated zone from an old chemical plant. Meridian needed to acquire the property quietly so they could clean up the contamination without admitting liability. Contamination, industrial solvents. Buried 40 years ago, the EPA has been tracking groundwater contamination in this area, but they couldn't identify the source because the records were sealed. Meridian knew because they owned the original chemical company. Margaret stared at Teresa in disbelief. "So they weren't just stealing my house for a shopping mall. They were stealing it to cover up environmental crimes and to stick you with the cleanup costs if the EPA ever traced it back to individual properties. If you'd lost the house to foreclosure, you'd still be liable for any environmental remediation as the last legal owner." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Margaret realized she hadn't just been fighting for her home, she'd been fighting against a machine designed to destroy people like her while protecting corporate criminals. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood before a packed courthouse as federal prosecutors announced the final verdicts in the Meridian case. Robert Ashford, 25 years in prison, 14 co-conspirators, sentences ranging from 5 to 18 years. Total restitution ordered $847 million. Helena Blackwood, for her cooperation, received 8 years instead of the original 12. But for Margaret, the real victory came in the form of a letter from the EPA. The contaminated land under her house would be cleaned up at federal expense. Her property value would be restored, as she would receive additional compensation for the environmental exposure. More importantly, the investigation had led to the discovery of contamination at dozens of other sites, protecting thousands of families from unknowingly living on poisoned ground. As Margaret walked down the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions about her plans for the future. She paused at the microphone that had been set up. 6 months ago, I was arrested for having dandelions in my yard, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. Today, I'm standing here because sometimes the smallest act of resistance can expose the biggest corruption. She looked directly into the camera. If someone is trying to take your home, if officials are harassing you over minor violations, if you feel like you're being targeted, don't give up. Document everything, ask questions, and remember that your dandelions might be the only thing standing between justice and a system designed to crush ordinary people. Margaret smiled, and sometimes the most beautiful yards are the ones that refuse to conform. Epilogue. 1 year later, Margaret Chen now works as a consultant for Homeowners, facing HOA harassment. Her organization, Dandelion Defense, has helped over 200 families fight fraudulent foreclosures. Her house, with its wildflower yard and solar panels, has become a symbol of resistance in the rebuilt community. The Willowbrook Estate shopping mall was never built. Instead, the cleaned-up land became a public park where children play among carefully maintained wildflower meadows, and every spring, when the dandelions bloom, Margaret remembers that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to let others define what your home should look like. But late at night, when she locks her doors and checks her security system, Margaret knows the real truth. The Meridian Network was just one tentacle of a much larger system that preys on ordinary homeowners. Her victory was real, but the war between corporate greed and the American dream continues in communities across the nation. And somewhere out there, another family is probably receiving their first HOA violation notice, with no idea that their dandelions might be the key to exposing the next conspiracy. The question isn't whether there will be another Meridian, it's whether the next Margaret Chan will be brave enough to fight back before it's too late. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hit something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Headache Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.